Hey guys, we're back again. A little bit of a snowy day. We hit a couple of inches of snow overnight, and yeah, that always makes it nice when you're falling trees and you get that soft powder on the trees and everything that you touch. Everything that you touch, you get this blizzard coming off your trees. I'm going to talk a little bit today about tree species and how you can kind of tell what took place on the ground in the past by looking at the type of trees that you have there. If you know a little bit about the history of the ground. Now, they're into a stand here that's a mix of spruce, pine, balsam fir. We got a nice pine right here. He's got a little bit of probably a porcupine shoe right there on the butt. Years ago, we had a lot of problem with porcupines in this area. This guy here is probably 30 inches on the butt, or somewhere around there. We've got another guy back in here, and this guy is substantially larger. This one measures, we can get through all the balsam here. This guy is a little over 14 feet around at breast height. Circumference-wise, this would be, as far as I know, the largest or second largest white pine in the Maritimes for circumference. Now, height, he's not as tall as what maybe some of the other ones would be, but circumference at breast height, this guy is probably one of the biggest. Now, in around through here, you take a look around, there's a couple of nice pine right out in there. We're into some more pine right here. Now, pine has a strange little tendency to them. When you see a stand with a lot of pine, you can be assured of one thing. This ground burned at one time. Pine seeds in very well after a fire. Now, pine will naturally seed when there's no fire, but anytime that you see thick growths of pine. Now, we've been cutting pine out of here for 150 years, but there's still a lot of pine in here. So anytime that you see these big stands of pine, where I'm on the Miramichi River here, of course, anytime you see these big stands of pine, you know for a fact that there's been a fire. Now, these pine, the original fire that would have caused a lot of the big stands of pine on the Miramichi was the Great Fire of 1825. And that one there was probably a survivor or seeded in shortly after the fire. 1825, there was the largest fire in the eastern part of the North America, burned through here on October 10th. Burned from the east coast of New Brunswick across to the western boundary, burned into the state of Maine, and it was quite a catastrophe. There was a whole lot of factors went together that started that fire. Fires from settlers clearing land. It was a dry summer, getting into fall, and still no rain. And when the fire started, it went up the river crazy fast. And in fact, there's recorded stories that some of the old settlers at the time thought it was the end of the world. The roar of the fire was so loud. But pine, like I say, pine seeds in very quickly after a fire. Fire seems to be something that triggers the seeding of pine, and so pine takes off really well after a fire. Now, one thing you don't see on the front of this ground. Now, this ground here was 295 acres. It runs 1 3/8 miles from the river to the rear line, and then the lots are behind that. This is almost an oddity on the front of this ground. That's a maple. That's a red maple right there. Now, on the front of this grant, there's another red maple right over here. On the front of this grant, if you went back, you have to go back almost a mile to get into any amount of hardwood. There's a smaller red maple right there. And But the maple here are scattered, few and far between. In fact, this pocket here is unusual because right there, there's two other. You see they're not big. But here's what happened. After the Great Miramichi Fire, the settlers that were here when the land, what happened was the original landowners, the grant owners, were loyalists that came up after the war in the States, and they came up. The British government settled them on these grants here. A lot of them didn't stay. They packed up and went back to Maine, Minnesota, different parts of the United States after things settled down after the war. The next generation of settlers came along. Another nice pine there. The next generation of settlers come along, and they actually cleared the land, built the homesteads, made the farms, built the mills, you know, done the thing to create a colony here in New Brunswick, and they're the families that stayed. My family came here in 1820. About 1829 to 1830, they came to this property. We've been here ever since. But what happened after the fire was when the ground started growing up again, they needed pasture for sheep, cattle, whatever they had for livestock. And they were just clearing the lands out along the river, the interfall lands in the valley, which was prime farmland. Well, you didn't pasture your livestock on the very best of farmland that you had. You use that for your crops, to get your potatoes, to get your vegetables, to grow your grains, your hay to put up for winter. And so what they did was they turned the livestock in on these pieces of land. The new growth coming up after the fire, of course, there's a lot of little hardwood coming up into it. And so sheep, being, you know, pretty good browsers, the sheep and the young cattle would eat down the growth on all the hardwood. And so what happened was, on the front of these grants where they get in and pastured, now you have almost a negligible growth of hardwood, because the livestock eat the hardwood all off back in the 1800s. And now, this being part of what they call the Acadian forest, hardwood is a natural part of the mix here, but you don't find much hardwood on the fronts of these properties until you go in, if you go north in that direction. About a mile and a quarter, you come into good stands of hardwood, but not out here. Out here, these maple are usually younger trees, and there's not a lot of them. They just didn't get the chance to grow because the sheep and the young cattle eat the trees off as fast as they sprouted back in the days after the Great Fire. So there's a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of an interesting thing about woods. And, you know, you can look at a piece of ground and you can pretty well tell by the tree species what was one time cleared land, what grew back up as, you know, fields grow in. They'll grow in one mix of species, poplar, white spruce, whatever. You can look at ground and tell, you know, the ground that was clear cut in the 1970s seemed to come back in a different mix of trees than what ground that was clear cut, say, in the 90s would come back in. It seems that, I don't know, with the climate change, the thing we don't like to talk about, but with climate change, ground doesn't seed back in the way that it did, say, in 1920, 1930. There's a different mix of trees now than what there was back then. But it's just, just a little thing. When you're accustomed to the way that these forests grow, you can look at them and pretty much tell, well, yeah, that ground right there used to be an old field at one time. I can tell by the tree species, or that piece was pastured, and that's why you've got no hardwood onto it. You know, this piece burned. Look at the amount of pine that's on it, and just things that you learn when you're around through the woods. So anyway, that is that. And that is the top off an old pine tree that has come down here from somewhere. So have a good one. I'll catch you next time around.